The north did not fall in a single day. It dimmed quietly, steadily, as if the horizon itself were being swallowed by dust. Outposts once held by steady hands now stand abandoned. Flags that once caught the wind hang tired, color fading into the pale sky. Where there were footsteps, there is only the hush of departures, families moving south, leaving behind walls still warm from yesterday. On the national map, the northern districts lose their shade one by one. Borders that once felt firm now look like echoes drawn on trembling ground. A region that carried the weight of Burkina Faso's security is becoming a blank space, a silence where the state once spoke. And in that silence, a question rises. What happens when a country's shield becomes the first part of it to fracture? Return with us to the land that once held the fate of the nation's safety. Its story is not over, and understanding it may change how we see the future of Burkina Faso itself. The fall of the north did not begin with a headline. It began with small absences, a convoy arriving late, a clinic closing early, a classroom without a teacher. Little by little, the familiar rhythm of the region loosened, as if time itself were shifting its balance. By 2015, the wider Sahel was already strained. Movements across borders grew unpredictable. Villages near Mali and Niger felt the first tremors of insecurity, long before the world noticed them. Paths that once linked communities became uncertain, dotted with warnings that spread through whispers. By 2018, the pressure deepened. Roads in the Sahel region were no longer safe after dusk. Merchants traveled in groups, scanning the horizon rather than the goods in their carts. In markets once filled with the sound of bargaining, caution began to take the place of confidence. Then came the decisive years, 2020 to 2022. Small towns in the north found themselves cut off for days at a time. Messages from regional officials traveled slowly, sometimes not at all. Local leaders spoke of districts going quiet, a quiet that did not come from peace but from uncertainty. Maps changed silently. Lines that had held firm for decades became dotted lines, not on paper, but in the minds of the people living there. A school headmaster in Soum suggested that the region was shrinking without moving, a phrase that captured both the geography and the feeling beneath it. By the time the political shift of 2022 brought a new leadership in Ouagadougou, the north had already endured years of erosion. The new administration inherited a landscape where authority traveled slowly and concern traveled fast. Efforts to stabilize the region relied on rapid response units and auxiliary volunteers, but the terrain was vast, and the sense of isolation even vaster. Outposts became islands. A station once designed to watch over several villages found itself struggling to reach even one. Roads that should have taken an hour began taking half a day. A journey that once needed a few liters of fuel now required planning, escort, and hope. The crisis group would later describe these years as the period when multiple localities slipped beyond consistent state presence. It was a measured sentence, calm, factual, yet behind it lay a profound truth. The state was not absent everywhere, but it was no longer present everywhere either. For many communities, it was the absence of services, not the presence of danger, that signaled a turning point. Clinics closed because supplies could not arrive. Teachers left because salaries could not be delivered. Farmers abandoned fields because transport for crops could not be guaranteed. The North was not lost in a single confrontation, it was lost in a chain of interruptions. Meanwhile, regional solidarity weakened. Some communities, particularly those of Fulani heritage, felt increasingly exposed. Rumors replaced information, suspicion replaced cooperation. Where trust should have stood, distance took its place. Through 2023 and 2024, the pattern hardened. A village would experience an incident. Movement from that village would drop. Traders would avoid its paths. Officials would hesitate to visit. Within weeks, the village would appear on maps as if it still functioned, but in reality it lived in a narrowed silence. By 2025, analysts no longer spoke of isolated concerns. They spoke of corridors, stretches of territory where the state's ability to operate was thin, fragile, and dependent on external support. Some towns still resisted the tide. Others adapted by creating their own informal systems of protection and supply. A region once fully tied into national life now resembled an archipelago, each community standing alone, hoping for stability to return. And yet, even in this gradual shrinking, there were signs of resilience. Local committees tried to maintain essential routines. Religious leaders encouraged unity. Women's groups organized shared transport to keep markets alive. These were not victories, but they were anchors, reminders that the North still breathed, even as pressure tightened. But anchors can hold only for so long. By mid-2025, several districts had effectively detached from the day-to-day governance of the capital. They were not governed by a new authority, rather they existed in a vacuum, trying to navigate life without a stable framework. It is this vacuum, not a single incident, not a single moment, that explains why the fall of the North carried such weight. A country can prepare for a sudden shock. It is far harder to prepare for a slow fading that spans years. And as the North faded, the rest of the nation felt the pull. Security forces stretched themselves across wider fronts. Administrative resources were redirected. Political debates sharpened. The center felt what the outskirts had endured for years. A slow, steady sense that the ground was shifting under the map. The truth is simple and heavy. The fall of the North was not a collapse. It was an unraveling, bit by bit, line by line, village by village. And now, as we turn to the next chapter, a deeper question presses itself into the story. And if a region can fade without a single sound, what else might be fading unnoticed beneath the nation's feet? The breaking point of the North did not arrive with thunder. It arrived with stillness, a stillness that settled over outposts once built to watch the horizon. Men who had held those positions for years found themselves listening more than looking, wondering whether help would reach them if the silence broke. In the district lines near Yatunga, the first signs of strain appeared months before the country understood what they meant. A patrol reported that the road ahead felt different. No sound of distant movement. No herders calling their cattle. Just a thrum of wind cutting across soil that seemed to carry a warning. Then the small outposts began to feel the pressure. Stations designed for observation became defensive shelters. Forces inside them were not fighting for territory. They were fighting for time, hours, sometimes minutes, until support could be organized. But distance in the North was not measured in kilometers. It was measured in possibilities. A convoy delayed by 20 minutes might as well have been a day away. In some localities, the pattern repeated itself with painful consistency. A report of tension, a road closed, a supply truck unable to depart, a garrison marking its own rations more carefully, trying to stretch the limited food it had. Even without confrontations, stress accumulated like sand piling against the door. When the pressure sharpened in late 2022 and throughout 2023, small stations found themselves encircled, not always by visible groups, but by the absence of roads. A blocked road could isolate an entire district. A damaged bridge could turn a town into an island. The geography of the North could swallow mobility faster than any confrontation could. Those who lived in these areas recalled the moment when the rhythm changed. Families would wake in the early hours, gather their belongings quickly, and begin moving south. Not running, simply moving. Moving before options narrowed. Moving before the silence around them thickened. And as civilians crossed southward, the pressure on the outposts grew. Units that once protected villages now watched as the villages emptied, leaving them alone with decisions that had no ideal answer. A commander in a small northern station, speaking through an intermediary, described the burden clearly. We held our position because leaving would mean the community behind us had nothing left. We stayed for the ground. We stayed for the memory of it. But memory does not reinforce a wall, and sentiment cannot transform a narrow road into a secure one. Government forces attempted countermaneuvers. Rapid response units were deployed, often covering long distances with limited intelligence and unpredictable terrain. Volunteer auxiliaries extended lines of defense, but coordination was difficult. The region was too wide, the crossings too many, the gaps too frequent. At times, reinforcements arrived just in time to stabilize the situation. At other times, they arrived only to find that residents had already left, seeking refuge deeper inside the country. A pattern emerged, not of defeat, but of exhaustion. By early 2024, as reports from human rights observers highlighted incidents affecting civilians, the sense of moral strain deepened. Communities that once trusted government units found themselves uncertain of all sides. The north became a place where every decision carried weight, even the decision to stay put. Market towns that once served as anchors began to struggle. Merchants traveled south to restock, but many did not return. Those who stayed behind wondered if they were witnessing the less functioning days of their marketplaces. Trade shrank, livelihoods faded, and with each passing week the pressure moved closer to the administrative centers. The political shift in the capital after 2022 attempted to restore confidence. Yet the timing of reforms collided with the North's acceleration towards crisis. Efforts to stabilize the region were genuine, but the speed of events on the ground was relentless. By the time new policies reached the field had often changed. The stretch on security forces became visible. Units rotated faster than intended. Some were posted to areas already strained. Others were reassigned before completing their tasks. A national effort became stretched across too many points, too many uncertainties. And through this, the stories of the civilians remained constant. A teacher who once greeted a classroom of 30 pupils now found only 5. A nurse who once treated expectant mothers now spoke of traveling hours to find medicine. A farmer who once sold crops at a lively junction now walked through an empty marketplace, the stalls around him gathering dust. These stories are not simply background. They are the human contours of the crisis, the lines that reveal how communities unravel before any map does. By late 2024, pressure across multiple northern districts reached a point where some outposts could no longer sustain continuous presence. Withdrawal did not mean surrender, it meant survival. A unit pulled back to regroup would often leave behind a settlement that had already emptied itself. As 2025 unfolded, the pattern solidified. The North had moved past the stage of simple confrontation. It was now a region where dispersed reactions replaced coordinated responses. Everyone moved, civilians, units, officials, not because they lacked purpose, but because the ground beneath them kept shifting. And at the center of this movement sat a single question. If holding a position costs more than losing it, what does holding truly mean? The answer was different for every outpost, every commander, every family. But the consequences echoed across the country. The fall of the North was no longer an event. It was a pulse, beating through the entire nation. And in places where the outposts still stood, the question whispered through the walls. What happens when fighting no longer defines the front line, because the front line has already moved? The fall of the North was not measured only by territory, it was measured by absences. The empty chair in a classroom, the silent clinic corridor, the market stall with no cloth laid across its wooden frame. Before any district faded from the map, it faded from daily life. The first great shift came in movement. Families traveled south in slow, steady columns. Some carried goats, some carried bundles, and some carried nothing except the memory of what they had left behind. Those on the road spoke little. They were not fleeing an event, but a climate of uncertainty that thickened year after year. By late 2023, internal displacement had risen sharply. Entire villages in Yatunga, Odlan, and Soum found themselves divided. Half the households gone, half attempting to hold on. What remained was a fragile quiet, broken only by the sound of doors shutting for the last time. Services collapsed in a pattern that now feels inevitable. A clinic without supplies cannot treat. A school without teachers cannot teach. A road without security cannot link one life to another. The essentials of society frayed not because people abandoned them, but because the structures around them could no longer guarantee continuity. Health workers recount the moment they realized the system was slipping. A woman arriving after walking for hours, only to find that the medicines had not arrived that month. A child needing transport that no longer existed. An elderly man waiting for treatment while the clinic staff debated whether they themselves should relocate. These were not dramatic events. They were quiet, painful thresholds. Education suffered its own unravel. Teachers left gradually. Some intended to return, but the conditions never improved enough to allow it. Children drifted between makeshift lessons, household labor, or long periods of waiting for schools to reopen, waiting for certainty to return. Commerce followed a similar pattern. Markets once known for their color and noise dwindled into sparse gatherings. A trader might travel for days to sell goods, only to discover that the transport back home was no longer reliable. A cycle that once sustained communities became a series of fragile attempts to stay afloat. Amid this upheaval, the social fabric strained. Communities of Fulani heritage faced heightened suspicion and displacement. Homes were left locked behind simple wooden doors, the owners unsure if they would ever return. In some areas, neighbors who once shared water and grain now shared only distance, a distance shaped not by hostility, but by fear of the unknown. Reports from observers, domestic and international, highlighted incidents that deepened this fracture. Accounts of civilian suffering, contested responsibilities, and contested narratives circulated widely. Each account, regardless of source, contributed to a broader truth: trust was eroding on all sides. Politically, the center struggled to retain the confidence of the periphery. Local officials, stretched thin, attempted to maintain routine governance, even when administrative buildings stood half empty. For many residents, the state became both present and absent, present in announcements, absent in daily life. Against this landscape, the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré carried both urgency and weight. His administration inherited a north already strained by years of fragmentation. Efforts to stabilize the region through rapid response units and community auxiliaries were attempts to restore coherence, but the distance between intention and reality was vast. Policies traveled slowly, events on the ground moved quickly. In community meetings, elders posed a question that cut through the complexity. If we lose the north, how long before the center feels the same silence? It was not a prediction. It was a warning shaped by experience. Political debates in the capital grew sharper. Analysts spoke of corridors of concern, gaps in governance, areas of uncertain administration. These were technical phrases, but beneath them lay human consequences. For every district facing instability, a dozen families faced choices they never wished to make. The humanitarian dimension deepened throughout 2024 and 2025. Aid organizations faced restricted access, some suspended operations. Rural households that once relied on seasonal assistance found themselves adrift. Food insecurity spread not as a sudden emergency, but as a slow tightening around everyday life. And still, communities sought ways to endure. Women formed collective transport groups, moving together to markets when possible. Religious leaders organized shared protection arrangements. Youth groups established informal watch systems, hoping to maintain a minimum sense of stability. These acts were not solutions. They were gestures of resilience. They held communities together just enough to keep the North from disappearing entirely. But resilience has limits. By early 2025, some villages began organizing their own improvised defense groups, not as instruments of confrontation, but as efforts to preserve the remnants of community order. People guarded what little remained: water sources, grain stores, the last functioning well. It is here, in these improvised lines of protection, that we see the true cost of the crisis. When citizens feel compelled to fill roles once reserved for the state, the bond between people and institutions comes under strain. And yet, the most haunting question remains the simplest. If the North fractures, how long can the rest of the country remain whole? It is a question that moves beyond policy, beyond strategy. It reaches the heart of national identity. The idea that a nation is only as strong as the furthest community that bears its name. And in those northern villages where the state's presence faded, people looked at one another and realized if help was slow to come, they would have to become the line themselves. To understand the fall of the North, one must also step outside Burkina Faso, to the desks, conference halls and briefing rooms where international actors tried to read a landscape far more complex than any satellite map could reveal. Regional bodies spoke first. The African Union issued statements of concern, measured in tone but heavy with implication. ECOWAS monitored developments closely, offering diplomatic support and frameworks for stabilization. But distance complicates intervention. What looks like a clearly defined challenge from the vantage point of a regional capital becomes tangled when placed against the realities of northern terrain, shifting populations and fragile community ties. International organizations raised repeated alarms. Reports from humanitarian agencies highlighted displacement figures that grew month by month. Human rights groups warned that civilians were increasingly caught at the center of overlapping pressures. Uncertainty on one side, distrust on another, and, above all, the shrinking presence of stable governance. The warnings were precise, factual, and deeply sobering. Yet, even with these concerns, delivering assistance proved difficult. Convoys struggled to reach areas where roads had long been compromised. Field teams withdrew from certain districts after assessing the risks to staff and civilians alike. Aid that once flowed with relative consistency now arrived sporadically, leaving communities to fill larger gaps with fewer resources. Diplomatically, analysts outside the region attempted to interpret the shifting alliances and strategies shaping the nation's response. Some focused on the internal restructuring of security forces. Others examined new international partnerships pursued by the leadership in Ouagadougou, reading them as signs of a broader reorientation of national policy. But while these interpretations filled reports and editorials, the North itself remained rooted in a simpler, harsher truth. A region cannot be stabilized on paper. Throughout 2024 and 2025, the narrative of Burkina Faso within global discussions became increasingly tied to the fate of its northern districts. Commentators referred to it as a test case for the wider Sahel, a measure of how nations under strain might navigate pressures that arrived from multiple directions at once. But such framing, though academically useful, missed the human scale of the crisis. For families displaced, the question was not geopolitical, it was immediate and intimate. Where will we sleep tonight? Who will help us tomorrow? Which road is safe enough for the journey? These questions rarely made it into international briefings, yet they shaped the very fabric of the crisis. Meanwhile, foreign governments weighed their responses carefully. Some emphasized humanitarian support, some highlighted the need for accountability and protection of civilians. Some held back entirely, cautious about intervening in a rapidly evolving landscape. The result was a patchwork of attention, concerned but cautious, aware but distant. And through all of this, the most striking contrast emerged between how the crisis looked from afar and how it felt on the ground. Maps suggested areas shifting in and out of control. Reports spoke of strategic implications, but residents of the North spoke instead of disrupted harvests, abandoned schools, fading trust, and the long quiet of nights where help might not reach them. This is the paradox of international observation. The world can see the outline of a struggle, but it cannot always feel the weight of it. For maps may draw borders cleanly, but the ground beneath northern Burkina tells a story far more fractured and far more urgent than any line can hold. The question facing the nation now is no longer only about how the North was lost. It is about what comes next, not in months, but in years, perhaps generations. For the road ahead is not solely a military path, it is a civic one, a social one. a path that must rebuild the delicate threads that once held the region to the rest of the country. The first challenge is scale. Reclaiming ground is one task, reclaiming lives is another. Villages that once held hundreds now hold dozens. Fields that once fed families now lie untouched, soil drying under the Sahel sun. A region that was once an artery of national life has become a quiet stretch where routine feels like a distant memory. The second challenge is trust. Communities that endured years of uncertainty do not return quickly to old rhythms. Children who spent years without schooling need more than classrooms. They need stability. Elders who watch neighbors leave need assurance that this time the future will not unravel beneath their feet. Rebuilding trust demands a kind of patience that cannot be rushed by policy pronouncements. The third challenge is coherence. Security alone cannot restore the north. Hospitals must be restaffed and resupplied. Teachers must be able to teach without fear of disrupted journeys. Markets must reconnect to trade routes that feel safe once again. Every institution that frayed must be rewoven, carefully, deliberately, and with attention to the needs that communities voice daily. In 2025, efforts to expand national forces, the recruitment of 14,000 additional personnel, signaled the government's recognition of the scale of the task. But numbers on paper must translate into presence on the ground. Presence that is consistent, predictable, and respectful of the people it seeks to protect. Rebuilding a region requires more than strength. It requires steadiness. Three potential paths lie ahead. The first is prolonged contest, a slow tug-of-war where progress and setbacks alternate, creating a fragile balance rather than a firm recovery. The second is stabilization through anchors, strengthening key towns, securing transport routes, and restoring essential services that radiate confidence outward. The third, the most ambitious, is a full reknitting of the northern districts into national life, a scenario that demands cooperation between government institutions, community leaders, humanitarian actors, and families themselves. But regardless of the path chosen, one truth stands. No region heals in isolation. The North will rise again only if the rest of the nation sees its recovery as a shared responsibility. And in the smallest villages, this work has already begun. Residents repair wells with whatever tools they have. Youth organize night watches, not out of confrontation, but out of care for their neighbors. Women gather in early morning light to discuss how to keep markets alive, even on uncertain days. These quiet acts, humble, unremarked, persistent, form the earliest signs of renewal. For hope does not always appear in grand gestures. Sometimes it begins with the sight of a single child returning to a reopened classroom, with a trader crossing a road once considered too uncertain, with a field being tilled again for the first time in years. Small signs, quiet signs, but always signs of life. And perhaps this is the lesson the North offers the entire nation. Strength is not only the ability to reclaim a map. It is the willingness to rebuild a future. One village, one family, one fragile act of trust at a time. And as the first green shoots return to the fields, the question rises with them, if hope can take root here, what else might grow across the nation? The fall of the North is not merely a story about borders shifting, it is a story about the distance between a nation and its most vulnerable communities. A distance that widened year after year until the map reflected what daily life had already revealed. A region, once woven tightly into national identity, became a space defined by absence of services, of security, of the steady rhythms that anchor everyday hope. And yet, in this difficult landscape, something else emerges, a kind of clarity, a truth that many nations confront only in moments of great strain. A country cannot endure if its furthest communities are left to endure alone. For Ibrahim Traoré, the challenge is larger than retaking ground. It is rebuilding the connection between center and periphery, between Ouagadougou's decisions and the realities carried by families far from the capital's lights. Leadership, in such a moment, requires more than resolve. It requires listening to voices softened by hardship, yet unbroken by it. Across the villages of the north, those voices still speak. They speak in quiet acts: a repaired well, a reopened stall, a classroom swept before lessons resume. Acts small in scale, but immense in meaning. These, more than any formal announcement, are the seeds of recovery. But recovery is never linear. The same forces that pulled the region apart may tighten their grip again. Services must be restored not just for one season, but for every season that follows. Trust must be rebuilt, not through promises, but through presence. And the nation must carry the weight of this task together, for the burden is too heavy for any single district to bear. This is where the future of Burkina Faso will be decided, not in grand speeches, not in distant meetings, but in the quiet return of life to the northern horizon. A road reopened, a harvest returned, a family choosing to stay rather than leave. And in the choices ahead, the role of Ibrahim Traoré becomes not only political, but symbolic, a reminder that leadership is measured not by the breadth of authority, but by the depth of responsibility. For if a region can fall silently, a nation must rise deliberately. Stay with this story. For the future of a nation is sometimes written in its most fragile places, and the lessons from the north may shape everything that comes next.